Hey, what's up, YouTube and Instagram? This is Greg coming back at you. Today, I want to be answering the question if the war between Hamas and Israel is a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. This is extremely important and significant due to the fact that we are experiencing a number of questions arising from many Christians concerned about the war that is going on there and asking if this is the sign of the end, if this is the precursor to the coming of the Lord. Now, I want to get into this I want to answer this as quickly as possible. So forgive me if this isn't as thorough as you would hope, but I want to give you the gist of why this is not a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Okay, so there are any number of passages that people today will appeal to in order to attempt to justify and substantiate the claim that we are at the end. We're living in the last days. We're living in the end of the end of the age, and that Christ's return is imminent, and that what we're seeing in the Middle East is precisely a fulfillment of that. These are the signs. Now, if you know where I stand theologically and eschatologically, you'd be you're aware of the fact that I believe that all prophecy has in fact been fulfilled. And if you'll bear with me, if you're not persuaded of that position and that claim, then I trust that you will endure with me for some time, and so I can demonstrate from the scriptures how that claim is in fact true, how that position is in fact supported by the scriptures. But nonetheless, there's any number of passages that people will go to in order to try to justify that claim, but one of which, and I think is perhaps one of the most popular, is Matthew chapter 24. And in Matthew chapter 24, verse 6, the text says, "You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these things are the beginning of birth pains." Now, one of the things about Jesus being a prophet is that he was a phenomenal prophet. He was a specific prophet. He was of course, he was God in the flesh. And you must excuse me, I'm getting over a cold, so I might be coughing periodically through this video. And so, please excuse me. But nonetheless, Jesus was, although God in the flesh, he was a prophet. He was a prophet that Moses said would arise up like Moses. Okay, he was also Messiah. But being a prophet, unlike the so-called prophets today, now, the so-called prophets, the false prophets, because I believe that the charismata, there has been no cessation of the charismata. I still believe in the prophetic office, that it's in continuation today and will continue to be in continuation forevermore. But when I say the so-called prophets, I'm referring to those that are not hearing from God. They're speaking their own fancies, their own imaginations. They're declaring X, Y, and Z. And typically what you see from self-proclaimed prophets, so-called prophets, is they make these vague, ambiguous generalizations that virtually have universal application to everybody. So there's nothing surprising about the so-called prophecies. They just say something to everybody, and we don't know what that something is, and it just happens to apply to everybody, right? Jesus was not like that. So why I say that is because wars and rumors of war were going on up until the beginning of creation. It's nothing new. This was even predates the time of the Mosaic Law. It was nothing exclusive to the times it's not something exclusive, right? Now, what makes Jesus's prediction about the wars and rumors of war unique? Because so often we read ourselves into the text and say, oh, there's war in Ukraine, there's war here, and so therefore we must be at the end. Christ's return is imminent, therefore he must be on the brink of return. But there's a principle in hermeneutics, in interpreting the scriptures and its audience relevance. In other words, the things of which Jesus spoke specifically to his apostles in that first century, because it was the apostles we learned from the beginning of Matthew chapter 24, from verse 1 and following, who originally asked the question. So Jesus is answering a question that they gave. So it had to have applied to them. So this is what makes it relevant to that ancient audience, to that first century audience, and not relevant to us. Now, certainly it is for our learning. It was written for us, but it wasn't spoken to us. And there are a number of things that are supported internally within Matthew chapter 24 that supports that very idea. But Jesus is speaking this to them. And at the time in which he spoke this, they were experiencing peace. There was no, the Romans were not fighting against the Jews. However, some time later, there was the Jewish revolt. And we learned this in Josephus. And Josephus was an ancient Jewish historian that lived within the first century. And he reports in his book called The Antiquity of the Jews about how the Romans ended up besieging Jerusalem. And the Romans set the entire city on fire and destroyed the temple in 70 AD. Now, but once again, up until this time, they were experiencing peace. There was no war. And so Jesus said this around 32 AD. Okay. Now, keep that in mind. In fact, it was at 30 AD that Jesus began to speak about the coming judgment. In fact, even before Jesus began announcing the coming kingdom and the judgment that was to come upon that generation, John the Baptist began to announce the coming judgment and said to the Pharisees, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? The wrath to come was not hell. The wrath to come was the coming judgment that was to be poured upon Jerusalem due to the bloodshed, the shedding of innocent blood from righteous Abel to righteous Zechariah. In fact, I want to read that for you. We learn in Matthew chapter 23. And in fact, Matthew chapter 23, you do the logical sequence, 23, 24. So when we're evaluating 24, we have to bear in mind that it's a logical flow of thought that begins in Matthew chapter 23. Now, in Matthew chapter 23, verse 33, he begins to warn the teachers and the teachers of the law, the Pharisees, so on and so forth. He says, verse 33, you snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell? Now, the word hell is the word Gehenna. That's a transliteration. That's the Greek word Gehenna is a transliteration from the Hebrew word Valley of Hinnom. Valley of Hinnom was a place in the ancient world during the days of Josiah that the servants of Molech used to sacrifice children unto Molech. Okay? And now Josiah, who was a righteous king, arose and ended up condemning all those wicked people. And he ended up setting the entire valley on fire. Okay? It was where they threw all the refuse of the town. Now notice, God's judgment was upon them. That's what fire represented. What fire was indicative of. It's what it represented. So when when Josiah had set the entire city on fire, mind you, again, he threw all the trash and the refuse and the defilement of Jerusalem into the Valley of Hinnom, which is how and why there were worms and there was a perpetual fire, which is where we get the idea in Isaiah chapter 66, of which Mark quotes directly from in Mark chapter 9, referring to Gehenna, where the fire is not quenched and the worm dies not. Now, that is a foreshadow of the fire that all of Jerusalem was set ablaze by, particularly from the hands of the Romans. And mind you, Jerusalem is a valley. So when they set Jerusalem on fire, it became, quote, the lake of fire. It became, quote, Gehenna. But anyways, Jesus is telling the Pharisees, who warned you, it says, how will you escape being condemned to hell? This is the same warning John the Baptist gave concerning the Pharisees. You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come. The same wrath that is prophesied and is spoken of in Romans 9 and Romans, I think, chapter 1 or chapter 2, the wrath of God being revealed from heaven against the wickedness of the Jews. Right? It says, therefore I'm sending you prophets and sages and teachers. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Others you will flog in your synagogues and pursue from town to town. And so upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I tell you, all this will come on this generation. Verse 37, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you. And then it says in verse 38, look, your house is left to you desolate. Okay, so their house, i.e. Jerusalem, and the temple were to be left unto them desolate. And Jesus told us emphatically and explicitly in verse 36 of Matthew chapter 23, truly I tell you, all this will come on this generation. So now, once we, now not a upcoming generation, this generation. Now we know from Hebrews, from Psalms, and from Exodus that a generation was 40 years. Now when you do the math, the coming judgment, the coming kingdom is the coming wrath. It is salvation for those who believed and damnation for those who believe not. And this was announced at the first from John the Baptist, and then Jesus began to preach it also. Now, when you 30 AD, at the time in which it was initially announced, to the time of its fulfillment in 70 AD, how many years is that? 30, 70, you do the math, it's 40 years. And we know that a generation is 40 years, according to Psalms, Hebrews, and Exodus. We have to allow the Bible to interpret the Bible, not external sources to interpret the Bible. But a generation was 40 years, and Jesus said that this judgment would come upon this generation. Okay? And a generation is 40 years, and that's precisely what happened. Now, when you go to Matthew chapter 24, verse 34, in the same context, same chapter of which the wars and the rumors of war are spoken of, Jesus says this, truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. I don't know how more clear it can get. Now, what people have to understand is that, okay, remember in Matthew chapter 23, Jesus says, behold, your house is left unto you desolate. That was the judgment. Is the desolation of the entire city, the desolation of the temple. Okay. And recall again in Matthew chapter 24, when Jesus speaks about the abomination that causes desolation. In verse 15, so when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. 2 points. This has immediate application for the church who were dwelling in Judea, who needed to flee to the mountains so that they would not be a victim to the ransacking of Jerusalem by the hands of the Romans. And, right, that's point number one. Point number two is Matthew 24 in verse 15, when he makes reference to the abomination that causes desolation, the same desolation that was spoken of in Matthew 23, right, is derived from Daniel chapter 9. And in Daniel chapter 9, verse 26 and following, it says, after the 62 sevens, the anointed one will be put to death and will have nothing. The people of the ruler will come, will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. So do you see how the end of the city and the end of the sanctuary spoken of in Daniel chapter 9, verse 26 and following, was the desolation that Jesus spoke of in Matthew 23 when he says, behold, your house is left unto you desolate. What was the house again? The temple, which is why when Jesus was in the temple, he says, my Father's house shall be called the house of prayer. But that house was to be left unto them desolate. It's the same desolation that Jesus spoke of also in Matthew 24. And Jesus told us in Luke 21, Matthew 23, and Matthew 24 that all of those things would come upon that generation. Are you beginning to see how the puzzle pieces are coming together? In fact, if you read Luke chapter 21, Jesus says this, verse 20, when you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. What armies? The Roman armies. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, let those in the city get out, and let those in the country not enter the city. For this is the time of punishment in fulfillment of all that has been written. Now, if you read Eusebius, who was an ancient church historian, he records about how the early church Christians had fled from Judea to the mountains and were thereby saved. And yet the unbelieving Jews were destroyed. Now, it would interest you to know that leading up to this desolation, Josephus records, as well as Tacitus, how there were angels and chariots seen in the sky, and the voice of an archangel declared God's departure from the temple. You know why? Because God was consummating the new temple, which was the church. And so, again, in Matthew 24, what is spoken of? Is spoken of the end of the age. And Jesus said, right, that once that Jerusalem was laid desolate, that would be the time of the end. The end of what? The old covenant world. The end of the Mosaic Aeon, the Mosaic age. Daniel 9 said when the city and the sanctuary was destroyed, which Matthew 24 explicitly draws from and tells you he's drawing from. He says when the sanctuary and the city is ended, that would be the time of the end. Now, Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 11 says, these things have happened as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the culmination of the ages has come. Or let me give it to you in the ESV version. I believe it draws it out even more clearly. Let me get this real quick. It says, now these things have happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. Paul said that the end of the ages has come upon his generation. Now, people say, well, how are you linking the coming of the Lord with the Romans besieging Jerusalem? Now, I want to read this really quickly, and then I'll be coming to a close. If you read in Jeremiah chapter 4, it says in verse 11, at that time, this people in Jerusalem will be told, a scorching wind from the barren heights and the desert blows toward my people, but not to window or cleanse. A wind too strong for that comes from me. Now I promise my judgments against them. Verse 13. Look, he advances like the clouds. His chariots come like a whirlwind. His horses are swifter than eagles. Woe to us, we are ruined. The context was that the Babylonians were going to besiege God's people, and yet God is described as coming on the clouds. This is judgment language. It's also found in Isaiah chapter 19. Let me get that to you very quickly. Isaiah chapter 19. It says, a prophecy against Egypt. See, the Lord rides on a swift cloud and is coming to Egypt. The Lord's coming of riding on the cloud is prophetic, apocalyptic judgment language. Jewish apocalyptic language. So when Jesus spoke of his coming, as he told the high priest in Mark chapter 14, Verse 62, I am, said Jesus, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. He said this to the high priest and the entire Sanhedrin council. He says they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds. Why would they see it? Because all the blood of righteous Abel to righteous Zechariah would be required at that generation, and the Lord was pouring out his judgment and wrath upon them. And this language of judgment and wrath is described as the Lord coming on the clouds. This is nothing unique to the New Testament writings. Also in Psalm 18, Jeremiah 4, Isaiah 19, the Lord is said to be coming on the clouds. So now let me sum this up and wrap this up. What we're experiencing, what we're seeing happening and taking place in Hamas and Israel, with their conflict between Hamas, as devastating as those experiences have been to those who've suffered from it, this is nevertheless not a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. The fulfillment of biblical prophecy relating to the wars and rumors of war in the end had everything to do with that first century audience. It has nothing to do with us. It had everything to do with them. So if we're going to honor the text and provide a proper exegesis of this text and honor the audience relevance, we should not conclude the contrary. We should not conclude that anything taking place today is a fulfillment of biblical prophecy, because Jesus said that all that the scriptures testified of all that was written. He says this in Luke 21, that these are the days of vengeance, so that all that was written shall be fulfilled. Now, I'm out of time, so I hope that you found this video informative. If you learned anything, I encourage you to drop a like, to comment, to give it a share. And if you have any disagreement, I would encourage you to also comment a respectful pushback. With that said, God bless you guys, and you have a wonderful day.